Jacob, if I can lay out the red carpet for you, you are publishing in the Journal of Higher Criticism, something that Bob has had his eyes on and others as well. Paul, you've been digging into Paul, and we were talking a little bit about this over the last, 8 years now, just a little bit, hours and hours and hours. Let's talk about what you are publishing. What is unique about what you're doing with Paul and what you found? Because let's just lay out the consensus here and just say, most people think those 7 authentic, the golden letters, untouched, absolutely down by Paul, no interpolations, no nothing, right? You've tried to resolve this conundrum a little bit different, and maybe you can just lay out what your case is so people understand, and then we can get the master's thoughts about it from there. Yeah, the guy behind you.
Well, on my other theories, I've been very consistent on them, but Paul was the one thing that confused me for many years, the subject of Paul. And ultimately, so I start out with sort of entertaining the standard view, but quickly delving into and becoming convinced of the later dating for Paul's letters. And I placed them in the 90s CE. But then for a couple of years, I went back to the 7 letters. And then I find myself believing in the 90s CE yet again. And
might be worth mentioning to the viewer a few reasons, not exhaustively, but
I'll start off by saying we have the Synoptic problem, which pertains to the Gospels. But on the other hand, we have the Paul problem.
But that's the one we're not allowed to talk about.
That's right. And the Paul problem is something I'm proposing is a very complicated. It's not completely complicated on all the intricacies of it, but it is in a lot of ways complicated. So I'm proposing a complex solution to the Paul problem. And
what is the Paul problem for viewers who don't know first?
How many letters of Paul were actually by him, if any at all? That's probably the biggest element of it. And this also pertains to when did he live, which also depends on how many of those letters you accept, or even how much of what's in a letter you accept. Because you have redactional, hypothetical, theoretical versions of Paul's letters that some hypothesize. Like I've said before, I'll say it again, I reject hypothetical text because you cannot work with them in a concrete way. Because they're theoretical texts, you don't actually know if they exist. Your argument can sound as good as they may come, but it still remains theoretical. Now, one may say all theories are provisional, but this isn't the same thing. Theoretical text is taking provisional thinking to another level. You see my point?
Yeah, so if I may poke in here to get your thoughts.
Yeah.
You're bringing up hypothetical text. What is that? What relevance does that have? Because to use an example, I did a debate recently where I argue why Luke acts as borrowing from Josephus. When I speak to Steve Mason and other experts who are persuaded, the consensus, and consensus be damned, as Bob always says, they're the ones who put Jesus to death, right? I love how you do that. It's so clever. The consensus right now is that there was a hypothetical common source. And Steve Mason goes, nobody's ever reconstructed it. There's no way to reconstruct it. And he said, if you did try, as a philologist, he said, and he knows Greek quite well.
It's going to look like Josephus.
He said, it'll look exactly like Josephus. So he said, what you have is Josephus. And so how's that relevant to what you're talking about with Paul?
It's relevant when people try to say, there's something I don't like in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16. So some scholars will say that's an interpolation. We do not have manuscript evidence that that's an interpolation. Now, in my paper, I mentioned one example where part of it is missing 1,000 years later, but I think it's a Latin manuscript if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And
so you're resolving that interpolation problem a different way?
I think that if I remember correctly, that manuscript is missing 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, or at least verse 16. But here's the issue. That text is so late that text may be familiar with Marcion, who heavily abridged 1 Thessalonians 2:14 to 16 and removed the elements that about the wrath of God coming upon Jerusalem. That's not in Marcion's version. My suspicion is that that Latin manuscript was dependent on Marcion, and so it's too late, way too late, to be able to use as an argument that it was missing from an earlier text. It's from an earlier version of 1 Thessalonians.
Okay.
It just doesn't really work, and so it's not a good start. And the reason they'll say that it's an interpolation is because it makes the letter like it's after 70 CE, which F.C. Bauer believed the letter was after 70. He didn't think it was by Paul.
So that's the other problem is, like you said, the dating of this stuff. So they already have this idea that there's a guy named Paul. He's a Jewish Pharisee running around in the 40s and 50s. He's converting Gentiles. Like, we have this idea that I feel like the book of Acts has given scholarship. So like scholars already have a portrait because they trust a book that has historical verisimilitude, and then they're building off of that with these letters. And you're saying, hey, chill. That's historical fiction or fictional history or whatever you want to call it. You can even call it a mythography, a novel, a mixture of genres.
Yeah.
But you're looking at the letters and you're saying, this guy's like evidence in the letters point to after 70. I don't think this is a later redactor inserting it. This is just the author of this publication writing at a time that is clearly evidence of an earlier event that postdates this period.
Exactly. And you see the same thing, and you see the same thing elsewhere when they try to argue that, okay, well, this is, okay, what I mean is, if you apply that argument to 1 Corinthians to get rid of something you don't like, so it's like you see in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 about the human body is the temple. Mm-hmm. It is a physical, the physical temple is not needed. The body substitutes the need for a temple of God, because the body is a temple of God. The temple is within you.
Right.
Now, that also fits what we see in 1 Thessalonians of the wrath of God having already come in the past tense. It's not even a prophecy. It's past tense, like telos, in its utterance.
And it makes perfect sense when a temple no longer exists to have that kind of theology.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And so when I look at the internal evidence, I see, okay, these letters are after 70, and that makes sense of Galatians. Because, like I've mentioned in the previous recording, you go to Epiphanius and the Panarian, you got Corinthus causing the disturbance in Galatia, which I'll expand more on that in a moment. But when you look at the internal evidence, the evidence just screams out that they're after 70 CE, that these letters are after 70 CE. And if we apply the logic of 1 Thessalonians 2:14 to 16 to get rid of stuff we don't like in 1 Corinthians, it makes that letter looks like it's after 70. Then we can just keep doing this over and over again. Now, Paul had a lot of guts to go to Jerusalem and to and tell people, well, we don't need circumcision anymore. We just don't need that. Antioch. He was in Antioch when this confrontation with Cephas happened. That's what I meant to say. It's like, wait a minute. So he's confronting other hardcore Torah Orthodox Jews about this. That hardly makes sense before 70. If you read Josephus, what did they do to adult Gentiles? Forcefully circumcise them. How did that not happen to Paul? And I'll even go as far as saying, how was he not killed for even suggesting the idea that circumcision isn't needed anymore? And so if it's after 70, the war is already come and gone. There's Roman troops everywhere, all over Judea, and other places where there are Jews. That makes sense that Paul would feel safe enough to or the person calling himself Paul would feel safe enough to carry out these arguments, carry out his missionary activities.
Yeah, the only thing I could think of in my head, and this isn't points to what you're saying, is if I could find countless Jewish texts that I was pretty confident came from a very religious Jewish background where they are then going, no, we want the Gentiles in, but without circumcision and obeying the law.
There is no text
I don't
like
see
that.
That's what I'm saying. So I think it supports your idea that once the temple's down and the practices, the dietary laws, all these things stop becoming a thing that they care to have you convert. Like, you have to convert. Like, we see, Josephus mentions one of the kings who literally goes from a full-blown Gentile to becoming a Jew through it was embarrassing for the family and all, but he went all the way. He was joining in.
Talking about Isades of Adiabeni.
I'm not sure the name off the top of my head, but I do know.
It's the one where Eleazar and Ananias had that argument over if they should convert or not.
Right,
Isades.
right. But notice there's no middle ground. There's no like, hey, you could join and convert, but don't do all those things. They expect circumcision. But after the Jewish temple's gone, you know, it would make a lot of sense why a guy could run around with a real softer version of this kind of Judaism 2.0 kind of thing, if you will.
Yeah.
If you want to call it Judaism, you know, it's...
So I asked myself this question, what about 1 Clement? Because 1 Clement is a letter that was written by Clement of Rome in the 90s. I would say, I put it in the earlier 90s, like 93 CE, because the way it talks about the persecution has befallen us. I think the second Domitianic persecution had just begun. So I put it in 93 CE for that reason. And Bob, you'll recall this in the paper, I make this argument. And I think that when you look at Clement, you have a lot of problems immediately. One issue is you have the Greek word epistolon, which is being used by Clement. So he knows a letter. Now, granted, that does not preclude that there weren't other letters of Paul, but it's not a good start for someone trying to argue that there were 7 authentic letters before 70, because Clement only mentions 1, doesn't tell you the title of it, so you can't be sure it was written exclusively to the Corinthians like 1 Corinthians is. The material that is described by Clement, that's in that letter, does parallel content you see in 1 Corinthians. So which is what makes scholars think that Clement is quoting 1 Corinthians.
Okay.
But it has to do with that, the conflict, like, oh, there are different parties, Cephas or Apollos, that complaint about, or I wouldn't even say complaint, but the noting of different groups that you see in 1 Corinthians is discussed in that letter. In the canonical version, it comes across more of a complaint, whereas I've come to see it as more like a report by the original
Now,
Paul.
when you say canonical version, you mean you're talking about Clement, and then you're talking about what we find in Corinthians that we have. Okay.
That's right.
I ask because there are some who think when they talk about Paul, a canonical version is the Paul we read in 1 Corinthians, and then they think there was a prior version of that. So it's worth clarifying.
I understand that. And it's a good clarification. So when you look at Clement, you see a mention of a character called Fortunatus. He's mentioned in the second to last verse of 1 Clement. Now, here's the issue with that. This Fortunatus is mentioned in 1 Corinthians as well. But in 1 Corinthians, Paul acknowledges Fortunatus, they knew each other. But in 1 Clement never mentions that Fortunatus and Paul knew each other. Like, that's very strange. Why would he not mention that Fortunatus knew the great man called Paul, the apostle? That's odd. And what to make it worse is the way that Fortunatus is referred to in the present tense, he is still alive in Clement's day. Now that is even more bizarre. It's like, wait a minute, what is this guy doing alive many decades later in the 1st century, in the last few years of the 1st century? What is this guy doing still being alive? That does not make sense. And then you have the other issue that Clement knew that Paul was dead. If the Paul, that canonical Paul, was the person he was talking about, then Philippians does not make sense because he's mentioned there as well and is being acknowledged by, quote unquote, Paul as being written in the book of life.
Talking about the guy that you were just naming.
Yeah. So like, that just seems quite paradoxical. It doesn't really make sense. Unless canonical Paul is not the same man that Clement knew as Paul the Apostle, the historical Paul that he's referring to. And so then I asked myself this question, who was canonical Paul? Who was that man? Before I get there, I need to talk about another issue, and that is the identity of Clement. So in 1 Clement, he never calls himself a bishop anywhere. Now, some will say that 1 Clement is a forgery and is attributed to Clement at a later time. But to me, it makes more sense if it was actually written by the consul Titus Flavius Clemens. Why? Because at first, it may sound ridiculous. How do we know these two Clements could be the same person? Well, Dio Cassius, or Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, says that Titus Fabius Clemens converted to Judaism. He was killed because he succumbed to Jewish ways. So what are the odds? You have two Clements in the same time period. And the reason that people think that this can't be this, one of the reasons they'll say that that these two can't be the same guy is because Eusebius has Clement conveniently dying just a few years later. But before Eusebius, nobody says that Clement was killed under Trajan. And a Trajanic persecution of Christians is kind of iffy. But we know with Domitian, there was clear evidence of persecutions of multiple groups. And some Christians were caught in the middle of Domitian's second persecution of the philosophers in the 90s. So the best evidence that these two Clements are the same guy is the fact that Dio Cassius noted that Clement, Titus Fabius Clemens, succumbed to Jewish ways. That's very powerful evidence it's the same person. And so this also lines up with the mention of Epaphroditus in Philippians. It's mentioned, by the way, they're mentioned in the same order. Clemens first, then Epaphroditus. Actually, I got that backwards. Epaphroditus and then Clement, which is actually the order of how they're killed. If I'm remembering the order correctly, but I do know, regardless of how I put it there, the order is the same as what Cassius Dio gives us. It's the same order. And so my point is, it's a very odd coincidence, especially with Caesar's household being mentioned in Philippians. When you put all that together, the fact that Clemens was killed because he succumbed to Jewish ways, it adds up. It just makes it highly improbable to me that this is just some freak coincidence. Where do you have evidence of a Clement and Epaphroditus anywhere else in the first century that fits that scenario of what you see in Philippians? Which again suggests 90 CE again. Now we're coming back to Corinthus. So Epiphanius says that Corinthus was the one that stirred up the disturbance in Galatia that caused Paul, I'm going to say canonical Paul, until I get to who I'm referring to here in a moment. So Corinthus is the one that stirred up this disturbance. What does that mean? Oh, well, Corinthus was writing in the 50s, man. He was running around there. We'll just assume that. Well, that doesn't work when you read Irenaeus, because Irenaeus is writing much earlier than Epiphanius, tells you when Corinthus lived. By telling us about the confrontation with John of Ephesus, as I'm going to refer to him as, because he was in Ephesus. This was after Emperor Domitian's assassination in 96 CE. They were in Ephesus in 97 CE. And John was like, this whole bathhouse is impure because of the presence of that man, Corinthus. Because he couldn't stand Corinthus. He viewed Corinthus as a heretic for the things that he was saying. But if that happened in the 90s, which it did, Irenaeus is pretty clear, what do you do with Epiphanius' Panarion then? You're going to claim, oh, well, Corinthus, he just lived a long life. You know, he confronted Paul like 40, 50 years ago. Then he confronted John of Ephesus 40, 50 years later. Come on. This was happening in the 90s. This is not happening earlier. That's when the situation's happening. It happened in 97 CE, just a little earlier, a little while before, not too long before his confrontation with John. And so what does that mean about who is canonical Paul? Well, we got the time period worked out. So can we figure out if there's another church father that gives us the identity of who wrote canonical Paul as Paul in the last quarter of the first century, or the last 30 years of the first century, that fits the evidence that we see in Epiphanius and Irenaeus, and that's what Jerome says. He mentions Saul from Giscala. This man who fled from Giscala, or Gush, in 67 CE when the Romans took it. He literally says this, the Romans, when they took Giscala, Saul fled with his family to Tarsus. Then he was taught by Gamaliel. I'm like, well, wait a minute now.
What source is that in?
That's Jerome's on illustrious
And
man.
he said it was Gamaliel that he was talking about? Okay.
But that can't be Gamaliel the first, because that doesn't work. He died in like 52 CE. But there was another one, Gamaliel II. And that's the one Jerome's talking about. He was the one that he was the next Gamaliel that became the Nasi president of the Sanhedrin in the late 1st century. So he would fit the period. I think he became the leader of the Sanhedrin around 80, if I remember correctly. And so that's the Gamaliel that would have taught him. Now in Acts, Gamaliel is situated as the first one before the war. So Acts is dialing it back. And Jerome says that his source was Epaphroditus. And I'd like to get your thoughts on all this, Bob, in just a moment. So this is not a hypothetical text. Epaphroditus is the source of Jerome's information. For the lack of a better words, I'll just say it's a proto-Acts. What Epaphroditus wrote, I think could be referred to as a proto-Acts, because it contains material that overlaps with Acts, but it also contradicts it. And canonical Acts is changing the information there, but we cannot know beyond the brief description that were provided by Jerome what is fully entailed by the canonical Acts' alterations of Epaphroditus' text, because we don't have it. And in accordance with my principles, I will not attempt to reconstruct the rest of the text that we do not have. I just have to go by what Jerome briefly mentions, and that is it. I'm stuck with that. And so I conclude that Saul from Giscala was canonical Paul. And he was pretending to be Paul from the 30s. Now, why do I put Paul that early? Well, Clement says that Paul was killed by envious men. And there are two scholars, Christian scholars, that think that Paul was killed by Christians. David Eastman and Oscar Coleman. They both argued that other Christians killed Paul. Not Romans, other Christians. And I see what makes them think that. Because in Clement, you have these envious men who are apparently behind Paul's death. Now, I don't think I would call them Christians as we know them. I think there was something else going on. And I'll tell you what my suspicion is about why he was killed. In the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, you have Paul attacking James. He's called Saul in the text. He attacks James, the brother of Jesus. Tries to kill him, but he fails. Now, so-called Pseudo-Dorotheus of Tyre gives us another account by Abdias of Babylon, who finishes the story. And I can tell it's the same story because Saul attacked James, and James does survive, just like what you see in the recognitions. But then another unnamed assailant with a fuller's club brained James with it and finished him off. He did not survive. And so the story is finished. But then I asked myself, well, someone might say, well, maybe Abdias was dependent on whoever's calling himself that was dependent on the recognitions. And it's still pseudo, it's not historical. And it was just randomly made up as anti-Pauline polemics, which I always found the argument to be very weak. Oh, it's just anti-Pauline polemics. I'm like, it's a very strange story to invent that Saul attacked James and tried to kill him. By anyone, really. Like, there's not really good evidence for any sect that would have done this, even with the Ebionites. There's not good evidence to suggest that this really happened, that somebody just made this up out of thin air to try to slander Paul. I doubt it. Now, the recognitions in book 1, so it's volume 1, you go to chapter 71, you get a reference to a letter from Zacchaeus, letters from Zacchaeus, which Clement says was referring to James, brother of Jesus, and referring to Caiaphas, the high priest. And I realized Pseudo-Clement, so-called, is citing Zacchaeus' correspondence as a source for book 1. For a lot of the information in book 1. including the material about Saamagus, the material about Paul, Saul, and James, all of the attack on James, all of that. So he's telling us about letters from Zacchaeus, not hypothetical text. He's telling us, I saw these letters. I know about these letters. I'll just say I know about these letters. This is a more accurate way of putting it. I know about these letters from Zacchaeus, which would put Recognitions as using a major text for its information, at least book 1, in the late 30s, when the attack happened. Now, why do I put that? Why do I say that? Well, let's go a couple chapters earlier. Go to chapter 68 in book 1. Gamaliel and Caiaphas are both named, active in their respective positions of power. Caiaphas was high priest. Gamaliel first was the Nasiah of the Sanhedrin at the time. The only time they were both in power like that in their respective positions was from 30 to 36 CE. So it gives you a really good idea when this attack happened, somewhere in that 6-year range. And given that Caiaphas was removed from power, so was Pilate around 36 CE, and Herod Antipas a couple of years later, it makes sense to say that the attack happened in 36. There's another way I can be pretty sure that happened in that way, that the chronology. Because the recognitions in book 1 again, book 1, I'm not looking at the later books here. Book 1 is heavily dependent on this correspondence, because when you get to the later books, you get into historical fiction, massive historical fiction. And what Pseudo Clement is doing is he's incorporating real information, then mixing it in with historical fiction that he created for his own purposes. So I'm primarily dependent on book 1 for the claims that I'm making about these texts. So Zacchaeus, as relayed to us by Pseudo Clement, mentions a confrontation on Mount Gerizim with Samaritans. Sound familiar? Josephus, because he talks about that too. And what you have is, you have James and John, the sons of Zebedee, showing up in this story. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. That's not an axe. What is this? And these two are going up their mount. They're going up there with them and trying to stop them from doing their thing. They were trying to intervene with what these Samaritans are planning to do. I'm like, we're being told a more elaborate story about the Mount Gerizim incident in Josephus. That's incredible. And then the text goes on to imply that they were slain during the incident. And I'm like, wow. They were killed by Samaritans. That's what it seems like to me, because they fell silent. Or they went silent. They never show up in the text again in the recognitions. They're gone. They never show up again. Papias confirms that this interpretation is true. Because he says, Jews killed John and James, sons of Zebedee. Papias says that. He directly contradicts Acts. And this is quoted by a 3rd or 4th century church father, somewhere around there. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's in my paper. You have James and John, the sons of Zebedee, being killed by Jews, and Samaritans can be referred to as Jews, because they are. There's a different group of Jews. So what's happening is, you have James and John being killed in 36, and then the attack on James by Saul is placed after that. See my point? Mm-hmm. So that's another way I can know 36. And I wondered, why was Caiaphas removed from power? Josephus doesn't say. Caiaphas was removed from power at the same time Pilate was. Now, one could say, well, it's standard procedure, because Pilate was controversial, and the high priest that worked with him is going to get removed too. But that's not really explained by Josephus. He just doesn't really explain the connection there. But you can get an answer from the recognitions. Because the recognitions has Caiaphas. When I say recognitions, I'm really saying Zacchaeus, because that's where the information is coming from. The recognitions has Caiaphas giving Saul orders. It actually says that. The enemy that attacked Saul, James, that enemy was commissioned by Caiaphas. Text says that, point blank. So he's working as an assassin for Caiaphas. And given that James was killed, James and John, sons of Zebedee, were killed, John the Baptist was killed after them, 36 AD was a very bad year for this movement. Very bad year. They lost multiple leaders, one after the other, the chopping block. And that would explain why Caiaphas was removed from power, because he killed him. He's responsible for the death of a major leader of the Nazarenes, that are later renamed Christians, which is like the only thing that I believe Acts is right about. Especially because of the scholarship of James Tabor and others that make the connection between Nazarene and Seer, the Branchites. But that's it. I don't believe anything else Acts says about anything. Literally. So, Acts created this story in which James is killed by Herod Agrippa I, this fictitious death by Herod Agrippa I that never happened. And John just outlives him conveniently to become John the Apostle. I'm like, really? Now, why does Acts want us to believe that? Because it's trying to conflate John of Ephesus, which church tradition will do later, as the same person. So you can't have John of Ephesus be John the Apostle if John the Apostle was killed in 36. So what do? You invent this story, you contradict Zacchaeus, and you invent this story of Herod Agrippa killing James, and then just say John outlived him. It's ridiculous. And so that's what I think happened. That's what I think happened. I think it's a good interpretation of the evidence, because the other issues, the Gospels, they struggle with the whole Samaritan issue. They juggle with that a bit. Go to them, do you not go to them? Go to them, do you not go to them? Well, you don't want to create more tension when there's kind of a debate about that, right? By reminding everybody that they killed John and James. Can't have that. So what do? Blame a Roman clan king then for at least one of their deaths and have the other one outlive the other. Which is exactly what Acts does. Now to stay with Acts for a moment, you have, of course, the attack on Stephen. Robert Eisenman, in his books, he claims that the death of Stephen is based on James. I think he's right. But the issue here is he does not tackle Abdias of Babylon. Doesn't talk about anything he says. Abdias of Babylon believes, let me start over. Eisenman believes that James survived the attack by Saul in the 40s, so he misdates what Recognitions is talking about. Recognitions does not place the attack in the 40s. It places it in the 30s. So I'm not sure why Eisenman claims it was in the 40s, because it was really in the 30s when this happened. Setting that aside, he then has him being killed in 62 CE by Hanan ben Hanan, or Ananus, son of Ananus. So you see what Eisenman's doing there? He's trying to harmonize the chronological conflict by claiming that, James survived the first attack, and he gets killed decades later by the high priest. And the only thing I can think of is, to me, it seems just as problematic as trying to say, or at least almost as problematic as, a Christian apologist saying, the Judas and Matthew, the death of Matthew and Acts can be harmonized.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, he hung himself and his guts exploded. That's the ticket. Well, I see the same kind of problem with James going on here. I'm like, so he survived the first attack, then he gets killed decades later. And then when you read the church fathers like Jerome, he starts conflating multiple deaths of James together. Smashes them on top of each other, files them on top of each other like rocks. Mm-hmm. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute now. He gets thrown off the pinnacle, stoned, then attacked to a Forest Club. This is too much death for one guy.
Yeah.
You don't see that in earlier martyrdom stories of James. This is clearly an evolution and a conflation of at least two deaths. And so that's that's the issue. That actually screams out that there's more evidence that these two are not the same guy. And that's why Jerome had to engage in such a ridiculous conflation, because he was trying to say it's all happening to the same man. Because in the 3rd century, the Jerome's in the 4th century, just to get everybody straight on the chronology. The 3rd century, you have Origen of Alexandria. Origen is the first church father to claim that Josephus mentioned James, the brother of Jesus. Before Origen, nobody says that he mentioned him. Now, I am not claiming it's an interpolation. I don't accept interpolation arguments without evidence. And I mean manuscript evidence or external witnesses saying it wasn't there. Now, that said, it's still the case that it's not until Origen that Christians took note that Josephus mentioned James. When Origen made the James passage popular, that was when the major harmonization started to happen. Because Jerome is after that, much later in Origen. And he's trying to conflate these different deaths to make it work with Josephus. Mm-hmm. Because of Origen. And that is like, this doesn't work. Now, in the 2nd century, you have 1st and 2nd apocalypses of James. And the 1st apocalypse of James claims that its source was Addai. And Addai had written 10 years after the Lord's wrath, something like that. So I take that to mean 10 years after the destruction of the temple, which would be 80. Right between when Josephus wrote Wars and Antiquities, by the way. That's a big deal, because Addai is supplying information to the 1st and 2nd apocalypses of James, which were written in the 2nd century. These are Gnostic texts. The 1st apocalypse of James says that James, the son of James, son of Phaedo is actually mentioned in the 2nd apocalypse of James. But in the 1st apocalypse of James, James is referred to as the spiritual brother of Jesus. Because Jesus in there is saying, you're my brother, although not materially. Why is that important? As John Painter noted, the James in the Apocalypse of James was killed in the same manner that Josephus of James was. Jewish authorities got together and ordered him to be stoned to death. Same death we see in Josephus. And these texts are saying that's not Jesus' brother. That's a spiritual brother. Rather than claiming that some Christian scribe was super confused about stuff or interpolated it on purpose, and not just by accident or in a margin note and all that stuff that's super theoretical because we don't have any evidence that's an interpolation, any real evidence that's interpolation. I would say it's much more likely for Josephus, who wasn't a Christian, to be confused about such matters. He said that James was the brother of Jesus called the Christ, Legomeno Christum. And I think the reason Josephus said that was it was his way of conveying there might be a problem with the information I received here, but I don't care enough to get into the details. See my point? So it's like, I'm just going to say skeptical about the way that Jesus is being referred to as Christ here, because that's just what they think. I don't believe that he is the Christ. In the testimonium, I think Josephus is employing similar caution. He said, in Christu was Christ, or Christu in. It was Christ, or Christ he was. It's like, if he wanted to say Jesus is the Christ, he was at Estine. Estine is the Greek word for is. So if he had said that, that would have made the testimonium way more problematic, for sure. But that's not what Josephus says. He does not refer to Jesus being the Christ in the present tense. Anyway, the reason I made this point. We got James dying a hell of a lot earlier, according to the earlier evidence, than 62 CE. He's getting killed in 36 CE, which means that the James that Josephus was talking about was not James, brother of Jesus, despite what Josephus said. That's a different person altogether. And Addai knew this. he knew that was not James, brother of Jesus. The Gnostics preserved that information and they put their own spin on it. But nonetheless, that is evidence, at least some evidence, that James, brother of Jesus, and Josephus is not the guy. It's not actually the real James, brother of Jesus. That's the spiritual brother. And so when I put all that together, when I put all that information together, I see that the conflict in Galatians between Saul from Giscala and Corinthus, it's being backdated. And so Corinthus is being replaced with James. And Cephas, I think that Cephas is also, so I think that Cephas represents the Bishop of Jerusalem, Simon Bar Cleophas. Yeah, he was bishop at that time when this whole thing was going down. And so I think what was happening is Cleophas plays the role of Cephas who gets the hell out of the way when these men from James comes in and shows him who is boss, so to speak. And so what's happening is that Saul is placing them in an earlier context. And before I go on, because there's a couple more things I'd like to cover real quick, and I know we've probably been going for a bit here, but Bob, what are your thoughts on this so far?
Well, it's the fact that you have different characters with the same name practically invites stuff like this. And it's like a kind of a strategy. Well, who's going to be whom here?
Yeah.
So there's, and I love and agree with the Cephas or Cephas and, well, even Caiaphas I'd throw in somehow. But
they are related, linguistically.
And Simon Bar Cleophas, to me, that is so important. James the Just and Simeon Bar Cleophas, brethren of Jesus. These are like Albert Schweitzer would have said, unexploded shells on the battlefield. There's something potentially very important. Why do we even know the names of these guys unless they're the tips of the iceberg? So I find this really fascinating.
Now, some may raise an issue and say, oh, come on, really? Saul? The forger's name is actually named Saul, and he's pretending to be Paul, who was also called Saul. Come on. So my response is, well, and I like to get these images in here when I talk about this. There's some freak coincidences in the modern world that kind of prove my point that these things can happen. You've got. There was this incident where you had I told you about this before, Derek. You had two baseball players with the same name, the same looks. I'm like, it is really interesting. That stuff can actually happen.
Oh, yes.
And my point is, I think it is therefore possible. It allows for the possibility that a situation like this can happen. And Paul and Saul are not really the same name anyway. They're just very similar names, but they're not exactly the same name. When I look at Abdias, and this is engaging with Michael Koshinash's work, that Michael Koshinash will say that Saul and Acts is literary fiction, and based on the way Acts is utilizing Euripides' Bacchae. Yes, I agree with that. But that does not preclude that the original Paul was called Saul for another reason. And what is that reason that I think is going on? The original Paul was being called that to compare him to the persecutor, King Saul. You don't have to have him having a conversion story to have that. The reason he was being called that was an insult. Acts turns the insult on its head and says, no, that was his past. Acts recontextualizes it. That was his past. Now he's Paul as the good guy. Acts is elaborating it, creating an entirely different situation for the way Abdias and Zacchaeus are referring to Paul. When they referred to him as Saul, that's not what they had in mind. They were calling him that to tell people, this man is like Saul, hunting down Jesus' followers, just like King Saul did. And not because he converted, not because he became a better person. See my point? It's different from the way Acts is utilizing the story, utilizing the name Saul. Saul's name is utilized very differently in Acts. And so Zacchaeus and Abdias, what I'm saying about them is not in conflict with Michael Koshinash's point regarding Acts, because Acts is doing something very different.
Well, the name Saul might be attractive with the association of is Saul also among the prophets, and he became another man, I think it says. I mean, these things don't have to be a consistent system, but when you ask what associations would ancient Bible readers like modern ones have with what things can we pick out of the stories of Saul to utilize? I admit it's uncontrollable, but
one that R.G. Price brings up, and I'm only referencing because it's a recent thing I've narrated and I remember, is adding to what you're saying, Jacob, is first of all, King Saul comes to mind, obviously. I think we all recognize this.
Absolutely.
Koshinash's work was fascinating. I think he hit the nail on the head. You have to think of the persecution and of King Saul chasing King David, which Jesus is saying, why do you persecute me? This idea is that the Christians are in his body. They are part of his genealogy now. They are descendants of David, in a sense, in Christ. So Christ is they're claiming within the narrative, he is a son of David. And you can go back to Paul. Paul says he's of the seed of David, right?
Indeed.
But even another layer that a buddy Charles, the other guy, said in his documentary is, and I've heard this by Rabbi Tovi Singer in passing, which was an odd, interesting reference. But I know that he mentioned it, Charles, the guy in his upcoming documentary on the Messianic Secret, is that it's not just that he's King Saul reference. It's not just that, we have the letters that say he persecuted. It's that King Saul is a Benjaminite. Okay?
In Philippians.
And if you go to Genesis 49, Benjaminites will be ravenous wolves. There's a prophecy there in Genesis 49 that Benjamin, like the son of Jacob, is going to be a ravenous wolf. He describes these different tribes as different ways. So is this a remnant of something describing this character that they're trying to kind of hint at something that is saying you're a bad guy, you know what I mean? Like there's still some remnant. It's interesting to watch between R.G. Price's stuff, which he says really you kind of see the war, but he's more recognizing pro-Pauline stuff, whereas Charles takes it and says, no, you can see that the faction that was saying, Paul, no, we got to tame this guy. He is part of the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul, not good stuff, right? So like there's this battle going on in the material, in the text. I don't know what to make of it, but he brings in the ravenous wolf thing, and he thought, what would a scriptural-minded person think if they saw King Saul? He claims to be a Benjaminite. He's killing Christians, and there's a Genesis 49 prophecy that Benjamin will be a ravenous wolf. Is this a remnant, a fossil in these texts of something of a tradition that says...
Well, another card in that same deck is in 2nd Maccabees chapter 3, which I am the miraculous conversion of Heliodorus. That has to be one of the main constituents of the Acts conversion narrative, unanticipated in any Pauline letter. And in the beginning of it, we hear about some characters of Benjaminite and somebody is from Tarsus. And that jumps out at me. You just have to wonder, and that's about all you can do, but you have to wonder, did somebody collect these bits and pieces? Because they're otherwise associated in 2nd Maccabees.
I've heard your interpretation there, and I love that. I want to, if we can, Jacob, just to kind of recap, because I know you haven't covered everything. Your paper's got a lot more, and there's no way we'd even have the time. But I wanted to kind of recap here for the viewer who might go, what just happened? We just covered so much. They don't know 90% of the names. They don't know the places. It seems like what you're radically proposing, and I say radically as in it's not consensus, is that the letters of Paul are later. We need to reassess what's going on in the propaganda and the history.
Yes.
Okay, so you're approaching it that way. And one thing that came to my mind, just to make the comment, and then want to get back to the recap, is that I think of like all the floating different legends or myths of Heracles, or you name it, a character. And like, I don't necessarily, I think you can have one character and have several different narratives, like the death of Judas. It wouldn't shock me if we found 18 different versions, because I think that's what they do when they tell stories. So that's one thing just to throw out there. But
before you continue, what I'll say, what's different about that, it's not that they're merely different versions of the death. They're different chronologies. There's several decades off in the deaths, in these different death stories.
Yeah,
that's not what's happening with Judas.
Well, even with dating, like I guess, like, for example, even when we are pretty confident that Josephus is using Luke-Acts, or Luke-Acts is using Josephus, he doesn't get the same numbers. We know he knows the material. He's at least heard it or seen it. Maybe not the best recollection of memory, but Josephus puts different numbers on the men, different amounts of this, different this. And the other thing I would put is the chronology of what Acts does with Gamaliel. Gamaliel is given this speech, and according to Josephus, this is supposed to be, the death of Theudas is supposed to be in 44. Now, you and I disagreed on this, about how to assess this information, I think. Because I think it is talking about the same Theudas. I don't create a different
actually, Theudas. I do. I agree with you, but in a slightly different way.
Yeah, okay. So the idea that I'm coming up with is a chronology problem. And this is something Steve Mason brought up. How does Gamaliel in the 30s give a speech about a guy who doesn't die till 44 AD? And Josephus says it's under Cuspius Fatus that Theudas is killed, right? This Theudas gets brought up as someone who dies before Judas the Galilean. And what most Christian apologists and those who are trying to resolve this problem do is they go, well, there was another Theudas. Because they don't like the fact that Acts can be wrong. It can't be wrong. No, God forbid it can be wrong. So what do? They have another Theudas. They do the same thing with other characters as well. They do all sorts of things to fix this problem. And I just think he just got it wrong. And if you read book 18, you can see the chronology of how he would make that mistake in book 18 or book 20, where Cuspius Status is brought up, Theudas is brought up, right? And Cuspius Status, which is in 44. Then after that, like literally 2-3 sentences later, it says the sons of Judas the Galilean, and then he says, that Judas that died back there. So the chronology is Theudas gets named first, then Judas, but Acts gets it backwards, clearly not understanding Josephus.
Let me tell you why it's not the same thing at all.
What do you mean?
You're making this comparison that there could be different versions of Paul's death, and it may not mean what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you why that's not the case. It's a radically different situation. Because you can't read 1 Clement and conclude that Paul was killed by Nero. You can't do it.
Yeah, but there are stories where Paul doesn't get killed by Nero. There are stories where Paul goes all the way to Spain.
Oh, no. I'm not done. In the Acts of Paul, he doesn't stay dead. He rises from the dead. His head gets reattached to his neck.
Right.
So, which is where we get the story of him being killed by Nero at all. It's from Lucius Carvinus' Acts of Paul, this late 2nd century text. Now, where did he get that story from? As I show in my paper, he read Josephus. One of the ways I can tell he did was to mention Cestius the Centurion, based on Roman commander Cestius Gallus. We're told in wars that Solus and his brother Cristoborus appeared before Emperor Nero. This is a very dangerous thing they're doing. Why? Because they're trying to blame the whole war on Governor Florus. They're trying to say, that incompetent governor started it. It's not this other dude's fault, or we had nothing to do with it. We never hear from those two again, by the way. Ever in Josephus' works after they appeared before Nero.
Right.
I believe that Lucius reinterpreted Solus as Paul. And that's how he got the story of Paul being killed by Nero. he conflated, proving my point, he conflated Paul, the original Paul, with a different person mentioned by Josephus to come up with that story in the Acts of Paul.
Yeah, I mean, that's very
Sounds
possible.
pretty good to me.
Yeah. I mean, we can't prove it, but it's like, I mean, it's not off the table at all.
What Jerome says about Saul from the Scala outliving Nero, he's outliving the war.
Yeah.
These are bigger contradictions.
Yeah.
This is another level of contradictions compared to what we're talking about with Acts, Mystery Josephus, and the difference being that.
Or maybe he didn't misread it. Maybe he intentionally wrote something contrary.
I think
you don't. That's the thing that even Steve Mason's like. He doesn't even buy. I'm more convinced of he misunderstood the chronology. Steve Mason's point is authors write whatever they want. They can use the material however they want and create whatever they want, which makes it even more difficult when we're doing this kind of thinking, where we need to be very cautious and say, listen, it's what I think, but I don't know this, and I'm not like going to sit here and fight you on it. And like, it's a very interesting thought process to have, though. And that's all I'm saying is that maybe there are other ways to look at it too, on top of it. But your position, I was wanting to recap and getting the viewer to understand. You're showing why these letters are later rather than an interpolation theory to fix the problems. You're showing other characters in other records that we know they're using and working off of. I'm pretty convinced not only is Luke Acts borrowing, but you might even bring in Theodore J. Whedon's work and say, well, maybe even Mark knows. What about Paul's letters? You bring up the fact that you think Paul's canonical letters know Josephus. Yeah. So that's another contrary thing to most scholars don't think about. It's interesting.
That'll have to be on other recordings. We don't have time to talk about those parallels right now. Right. But
that'll be on you and me will record. Yeah.
I'm getting close to concluding this recording, but I need to come back to just real quick to really recap on the Paul's death. So I have the original Paul dying in 39 in Hispania. Because Clement does say he may have first west of the empire.
And that's this is a totally different dude. You're saying this guy, was he Jew? Was he a Pharisee? Was he
Jew? 100% different person from canonical Paul.
Okay.
But he dies in Hispania. This is the basis for Romans setting itself up as a prequel of Romans 15. Oh, I'm going to Hispania.
Okay.
The letters never have him making it there. So, I got Paul dying in 39. Paul the assassin, Paul the so-called apostle. Then
a few years after he played a role with Caiaphas and was doing all sorts of dirty work.
I think that's why he was there in Hispania. He was living there in exile. I'll come back to that in a minute. Saulus was killed by Nero in 60 AD, the basis for the mythical Pauline death under Nero. Then we got,
and that's based off of Josephus' Saulus. Got it. Okay.
A conflation of yet another Saul with Paul. And then we got Saul from the Scala, and I think he died in 97 CE. We'll come back to that in a moment. I need to go back to Stephen and Eisman because I didn't finish there. Eisman's other problem is we look at Stephen. In Acts, we got Stephen Saul approved of Stephen's death. He's approving of his death. Mm-hmm. So Acts is using the same name as Zacchaeus did. And that's why Recognitions Book 1 does that. So the name Saul is employed when the attack upon James happens. It's the same way Acts uses Saul's name when the attack on Stephen took place. And Stephen's called the righteous. But then his death is curious. He's stoned to death. Like the James and Josephus was.
He smoked way too much marijuana? I'm just kidding.
But he's killed the same way that Josephus' James was. Even though the story lines up with what Zacchaeus and Abdias tell us about how the OG James, the real James, 36 was killed. James, brother of Jesus, is what I mean. So, I can tell that in Acts, it's already starting to blend him with the James and Josephus just a little bit. The process is beginning.
So you see Eisman's point. Yeah.
Well,
in a different way.
What's his name? Hans-Joachim Scheps had already said that the death of the martyrdom of James the Just is the basis for the Stephen thing. And it occurred to me after reading that what does Stephen say? Now you just killed the just one.
Mm-hmm.
I thought maybe this is a reference to James, a kind of a wink to the reader, or an uncorrected clue that, I mean, he's saying you've just killed James the just.
And you're to Jacob's point, even beyond, is if they're willing to take a different named character and play them, how much more so when the character carries the same names?
Yeah.
I mean, so if you have Stephen as a fictional fill-in for James, or vice versa. I mean, I imagine it's a fill-in for James because I do think Luke-Acts knows Josephus and not the other way around. Then yeah, you when you're dealing with another Paulus or you're dealing with another Saulus, when you're dealing with even more so, that should be suspicious to at least consider. You know what I mean?
And I would say that Luke also knew Zacchaeus' writings and Abdias, because Luke needs to have all three sources, because he needs to have Saul being there to attack him. You get that from Zacchaeus and Abdias. You need to have him get killed too, and near immediacy. He's got that too, because Stephen does not survive long. He's killed. That's the issue. That's the issue I wanted to get to. Eisman's comparison and the way he uses Stephen's death in his conclusion doesn't work. His Acts has Stephen not surviving for decades, even getting killed later in a second attack.
Because James dies in the 60s, so technically you're saying, okay. If you take that,
Stephen's killed in the 30s.
Right. But that's why I brought up what I brought up earlier.
Yes.
Okay. And the only reason I brought it up wasn't to push back against your point and to try and debunk it.
I don't even think it does.
I'm just making the point that if Acts is willing to get chronology off, or maybe he doesn't care.
I agree.
Then when Josephus has a James in the 60s do this and die,
yes.
Okay, then having a Stephen in the 30s is really irrelevant. And maybe I don't know what Eisman was doing there. Was he trying to harmonize it to make it work or something?
Yeah, he was harmonizing. That's why he says that James survived the first attack and then was killed decades later. But
Acts, so that's the harmonization. Yeah, he's forced to.
Yes, but Acts doesn't work with that harmonization. My theory does, because my theory says they're not the same James. And the primary James that Acts is overriding here is James in 36E, the one that was killed by the associate of Saul that we don't know who it was that finished off James. So, but Saul was involved in the attack all the same, just like we see with Stephen. Now, let's talk about Saul from Goodacre stuff, and then we can conclude there, because we'll have to talk about the parousia, like what I think the parousia was, and I think that had to do with the assassination of Domitian. And we'll talk about that, because that's a long conversation, which adds additional evidence for the letters being situated in 94, 97 CE. That's when I date the 13 canonical letters.
Got it.
14 to include Hebrews, because Hebrews talks about the release of Timothy, which Emperor Nerva is releasing multiple people, persecuted peoples that were imprisoned. So when Hebrews is talking about releasing people, same with the prison letters, that's what that's about. So why do I date Saul from Goodacre's death to 97 CE, or Saul of Goodacre's death to 97 CE? Well, in 2 Timothy, because I'm writing the pastorals in 97, all three of them. He's talking about, because this is throughout the pastoral letters. He's giving orders to Titus and Timothy, and he's talking about giving rules and regulations for bishops and episcopacies, about how they should handle things and who gets put in power as a leader and all that stuff. In 2 Timothy, he's like, I fought the good fight. I'm done. I've had enough of this. I fought the good fight. And that would have been in 97. Why? Because in 2 Timothy, he mentioned that his imprisonment was a recent event. He thanks Onesiphorus for visiting him in his chain back in Rome. That's in 2 Timothy. That's a very strange thing for him to say if he's about to get his head cut off by Nero. I was released? And then I'm about to get killed? That doesn't make sense. So the pastoral epistles do not support Christian tradition, about Paul being killed by Nero at all. It's a total contradiction to it. That's not what they're saying. And they're situated when Nerva's in power, because it's because people are being released from custody. They're not in fear anymore.
There's post-Domitian.
Yeah, right. And the parousia is not even relevant anymore. They're talking about other things now, setting up leaderships. But when the pastorals are dated, the typical position is, oh, it's well established. I'm like, I agree that they're late and they're not pre-war. I don't think Paul wrote them, obviously. I don't think he wrote any of the canonical letters. But the issue is, the pastoral epistles seem like they're not about the leadership already existing, but about setting it up. Because you see this, the same thing in Philippians, which you like to call a fourth pastoral epistle. You notice that they talk about the title bishops and deacons, but let's stick with bishops. But they're not naming who the bishops are. Who are these bishops? It's because there aren't any. They're setting it up for the first time.
Yeah.
The pastoral epistles are the beginning of the existence of bishops. That's what it's all about, setting the system up. And when we resume this later, and I also would like to talk about this with Bob as well when he's one of the next recordings. At the Airbnb. Yeah, and we'll talk about why I think the second coming of Christ was all about killing and pretermission. The entire second coming of Jesus was a ruse to discuss and plot the assassination of the Roman Emperor Domitian. It's not a literal second coming. And we're going to talk about Stephen in 1 Corinthians, because Stephen is actually a name of a guy that killed Emperor Domitian in 96 CE.
Amazing, ain't it?
Interesting.
And you probably know where I'm going with that. So we'll save that for then.
Okay. Let us know what you think in the comments. I'm curious to hear it, Bob. Thank you for hanging out.
How fascinating.
Yeah.
Getting schooled.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.